Hi, this is David from the Library of Michigan, and today we are talking with award-winning author Curtis Chin about his Michigan Notable Book 2023. Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. Um, uh, Curtis, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first, thank you for having me on your program, and thank you for the great honor of being noted as a notable book in Michigan. Yeah, I am born and raised in Detroit and the suburbs, and I went to college at the University of Michigan, where I got a creative writing degree in poetry writing, actually, and eventually, found myself writing TV and film on Hollywood. But when COVID came, I decided to work on a memoir, and that's the product of that journey. And it's called Everything I Learned. I learned in a Chinese restaurant. And it's about growing up in Detroit in the 80s. My family had this fabulous restaurant in Detroit called Chung's Cantonese Cuisine. Despite everything going on around us, whether it was the auto industry struggling or crack cocaine or AIDS, or the fact that I knew five people murdered by the time I was 18 years old, it really was a wonderful, wonderful childhood. And so that's what the book is about.
Awesome. So you have an extensive background in writing. What's the first memory you have that compelled you to write?
Um, well, I mean, it's a pretty serious, story about the Vincent Chin murder case, which I hope your listeners or viewers are familiar with. This was the 80s during the height of the anti-Japanese sentiment. Vincent Chin was out celebrating his upcoming wedding. These two white auto workers come in and they're overheard, saying some things like, it's because you blanks that were out of work, they're kicked out of the bar. And, eventually these guys get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit until they see Vincent sitting outside of McDonald's waiting for his ride to pick him up. They take a baseball bat out of the back seat of their car and they literally bash his head in. My uncle was his best man, and when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's in the hospital, struggling for their life, you're going to want to check the newspapers, right, to see how they're reporting on it. Um, there was nothing in the papers, nothing in the radio, TV. I checked the next day, nothing. Next after that, nothing. It took them 12 whole days. It took the media 12 whole days before they actually reported on this case. Meanwhile, everybody in our community was coming into our restaurant trying to find out what was going on. Um, and so that contrast between what our community cared about, the stories that we wanted to follow versus what the mainstream media was covering, really stuck out to me. And that's what got me thinking about the importance of writing and telling stories.
Thank you. What are three words which describe you as a writer and why?
I mean, though the description that I just gave you as to why I started writing, it doesn't sound very humorous, but my book is a humor book. I mean, I wrote, sitcoms and kid shows on TV, so it is a happy memoir. I mean, despite all the stuff going on in Detroit. I don't know. I don't know what three words are. I try to be thoughtful. I try to be inclusive in my writing. I try to write a story that was relatable to as many people as possible. I mean, I think that you might pick up the book thinking that, oh, you're going to learn about this Asian American kid growing up in the Cass corridor of Detroit. But, hopefully the stories are universal enough that anybody can find a connection to them.
Um, for you as an author, what's the most meaningful part of this book?
Probably the stories about my mom. I mean, my mom had a difficult life. She had an arranged marriage, never got to finish high school, and she worked so hard at the restaurant, and tried to really give me and my siblings all these wonderful opportunities in life. And so part of writing the book is really telling her story as well. So I think there's a very strong mother-son component in the book.
Um, what would you want the reader to take away after reading your book?
I don't know if I really have a thought on that. Hopefully they have a good time reading it. I mean, the greatest compliment that I feel that I get is when someone tells me, "Oh my God, I read your book in one sitting." You know
Mhm.
what I mean? It tells me that they had a good time reading it. They were interested in the stories, and hopefully at the end of the day, I think they learned something too. Um, about a different perspective that they may not share. So, one thing, the way I pitched the book to my agent was that we live in a very divided world right now. We have these little silos where we don't talk to each other, and Chinese restaurants are kind of one of the few places where you can go in and see someone from a different background, right? And if we could just sort of take that opportunity to have these important conversations, I think that's something I would want to come out of the book. The way I said it to my agent was, "Come for the egg rolls, but stay for the talk on racism." And so it's going to be it's a fun read, but yet at the same time, we do go over some serious things.
Um, is there anything that you learned about yourself while writing this?
Um, I don't know if I learned anything about myself per se, but I learned to slow down. I mean, I'm kind of a hyper guy. I mean, but I think that's sort of the way I, navigated my childhood was that, if bad things happen, I just sort of moved on, right? I didn't really dwell on things. But writing a memoir actually requires you to sort of slow down and reflect on things. And so that was an interesting process for me because I'm not a very introspective person in that sense. Uh,
Mhm.
um, I felt like once I committed myself to writing a memoir, I sort of had to um, do that, even going into uncomfortable spaces.
If you were to give advice to a young writer, what would it be?
Well, the one thing I always say to people that want to write a book or pursue a creative writing or pursue any job in the creative arts is that you're going to hear the word no a lot. Just don't let that voice be your own. Always say yes to yourself. Always believe in yourself. That doesn't mean that, you ignore the no's. What it means is that you actually listen to the no's because sometimes a no isn't a total no. Sometimes it's a maybe, right? Sometimes it's a not right now. And that's what you've got to figure out is like how do you convert those no's into yeses?
Um, what was your reaction when you learned that you were selected as an author for the Michigan Notable Book Program?
It's been a really crazy year for me. I mean, the first of all, I mean, just to even sell a book, I mean, is really hard. I've met so many writers during COVID or people that were writing books, right, and trying to find agents and then find a publisher. But I was lucky. I found an agent, and we sold the book in an auction. With all the big publishing houses in New York bidding in a giant bidding war for the book. So already that was like shocking to me. And then when the book came out, getting all this, acclaim from, everybody from Time Magazine to the Washington Post. I mean, CBS Saturday Morning News did a giant segment. I've been on NBC 3 times, PBS NewsHour, LA Times, Boston Globe. It's just the response of the book has just been like overwhelming on that level. And then even just small things where it's like, one time I was on an airplane and the woman sitting next to me, midway through the flight starts nudging me, and I thought like, oh, sorry, like I thought I'd crossed over to her side, but she's like, oh, are you the author of that book, Everything I Learned? And I was like, what? Just like it's strange. So, getting this recognition from the Library of Michigan was probably one of the highlights because, it's always nice when your hometown, embraces your book. So I think in that sense, because really I did write it as a love letter to Detroit and the state of Michigan in general, but really to Detroit, because the city's going through a revival right now, and I want to be part of that. And so, the ability to sort of travel around and say nice things about Detroit has been really, um, a gift that I've been given.
I remember those t-shirts.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's just so exciting because I tell people it's like, my childhood in Detroit was really about loss in so many ways, right? Like even just the fact that, when I was really, really young, like I remember every um, property had a building in it, right? But then just, as the years go by, they started disappearing and they started being replaced by empty fields and abandoned buildings. It's just, you know, that was just a continual theme, throughout the 80s and early 90s. But now it's like they're trying to, fill in all those gaps and it's just sort of nice. And I'm curious as to how it's going to redevelop. And so maybe writing this book, reminding people of this past is maybe a helpful thing, I think, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on to Detroit's Chinatown. I believe the state just gave them $1 million grant to redevelop the area. And so maybe some of those people might read my book and, give them a sense of, well, what happened beforehand, right?
So much of the neighborhood was lost even previous when the freeways came through and
Well,
everything.
that was the first Chinatown, right? Like in the late 50s when they destroyed Black Bottom. And then they moved to this area called Cass Corridor, right? Which is on Cass and Peterborough. And even that, it was a lower income area, right? Like I jokingly say, it was a lot of Appalachian whites, then. So it's the white hillbillies and the Chinese hillbillies moving in together along with the African Americans because Black Bottom had been destroyed, right? And so it was like this mix or cauldron or whatever of all these different low income, communities. Yeah.
Mhm. Who was the first person you told when when you found out that you received the award?
Oh, I don't remember.
Don't
Sorry.
remember? Okay.
I I have been on a massive tour for the book. I did literally over 250 events uh in the past year or so. And I also did 5 in Europe, and I'm about to go off and do another 5 in Asia. I mean, it's just been a whirlwind. So frankly, apologies that I don't remember, but I do
No.
remember feeling very, overjoyed. I think it came in an email, right? The
Hmm.
notification.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, what is what is one of your favorite reactions that you've gotten from a family member, a close friend, to the accolades and recognition that you're getting now?
Well, my family hasn't read the book, nor do they plan to read it. According to my sister, she has zero interest in learning about my sexual awakening, which is fine. I mean,
Mhm.
as my brothers tell me, that's your version of that history, so they don't need to delve into it. But whenever I post things on Facebook, they always hit the like button, so I think that means they're okay with the book. I do share another story though from one of our customers because in that way, I mean, they're sort of like our friends, right? Sort of like our extended family. Because our restaurant was open for over 65 years. And so we really grew up with a lot of these people. I was doing a reading in Boston, actually Cambridge, at a bookstore. It was packed. And at the end of it, the 60-year-old woman gets up and she's like, has anybody here ever eaten at Chung's? And nobody had because we're in Massachusetts. But she said she grew up in Detroit. That was her family's favorite restaurant. They went there every Sunday. And then when she told her mom that she was going to this reading, her mom, who has dementia now, started recounting all the details of all of our dishes, her favorite dishes there. And the woman said that she felt like she had her mom back for the first time in a long time. And, it's just these really touching moments, and the relationships that we had with our customers, which has been really, really nice, an opportunity to sort of reconnect with some of these people.
Is there any book now that's giving you joy or making you think?
Uh, God, no, I mean, I'm working on another memoir now, a second memoir. It's about, my dad's passing. Um, so in 2005, I was writing for the Disney Channel in Hollywood. And then I get this terrible phone call that my parents are in a car accident and my dad passed away and my mom was severely injured and my older brother Chris, the golden child, who is like this doctor in Los Altos Hills, California, immediately whisks my mom off there to help her recuperate. And by the end of that first week, all my other siblings decided they were also going to move out there to help my mom. And I was sort of stuck back in Michigan, having to make this decision. Do I go back to LA or do I stay in Detroit and take over this fabulous restaurant that my great grandfather opened in 1940? And so that's the next book that I'm working on. It's called Leftovers. And because I like to read books that are similar in themes or in that genre, I'm reading a lot of what people call grief memoirs, you know, just to sort of see how other people have handled these subjects.
Sure.
Mhm.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to share that you want us to know?
No, I mean, like I said, I appreciate, the love that the hometown has shown for my book. I mean, I literally, I mean, I've done so many readings there, like, not just with the libraries, but also the nonprofits, but also, like I've gotten to give talks at the Detroit Pistons, the Detroit Lions, Ford
Mhm.
Motor Company, Kresge Foundation. I mean, it's just the Detroit Historical Museum. It's just been wonderful how much, the city and its residents, have embraced the book. Like I got to give the keynote for this past Michigan Historical Society's conference. I mean, so that's really makes me feel good because I did try to make sure that the book said something about Detroit and that there's a lot of Detroit history in there. So, like, even if you didn't grow up in our neighborhood, if you have any connection of Detroit in the 80s, I think you'll pick up the book and really feel connected to it because I reference everything from the closing of the Hudson's department store to the Tigers winning the World Series to, Mayor Coleman Young being one of our regular customers. It's such a Detroit book, and that's why the love that I've gotten from, the people back home has just been really extraordinary. And it makes me, I don't know, maybe I did a good job.
You did a very good job, I think. I loved it. I loved it. I mean, that was Chung's was a restaurant that I went to when I was a
Oh,
kid. So I'm East Sider
oh.
myself. So it was very much.
Oh, oh, yeah, no, thank you. And it was really sad the way my dad closed that business, where he just sort of decided at the end of a week, like, I'm done. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And I begged him not to do that. I said, Dad, please, you've got to give it a month. You've got to give a chance for all these, customers to come in and have another meal or two, right?
Mhm.
But he just, I think he was just tired or just, I don't know, he's just emotionally couldn't do that. Or maybe he felt guilty that the restaurant was closing underneath his watch. So this tour, again, has been an opportunity to reconnect with people like you. You know what I mean? And while you're thanking me, and my family for running that restaurant, it gives me a chance to thank you for supporting my family and giving me and my siblings these wonderful lives. I mean, we wouldn't have been able I wouldn't have been able to go to college, you know what I mean, get a degree and pursue writing if it weren't for people like you. So thank you.
Curtis Chin, thank you very much. Appreciate it.